Hey everyone, my name is Dylan, and what I'm about to show you, I'm sure most of you know what it is, but in case you don't, this right here is a Sony PlayStation 2, and this little black box here changed my life. It changed who I am, and it put me on a totally different trajectory than I think I would have been on if I never had a PlayStation 2. Because, I don't know if you can see it, but there's tons of manga behind me, and I have a closet full of manga. I have been a fan of anime and manga for my whole life, and I honestly think that if it wasn't for this game right here, Kingdom Hearts 2, I wouldn't be as big of a fan of manga, of anime, of all things Japan, because Kingdom Hearts 2 was my first real exposure to that flavor of melodrama that is so specific to Japanese media, mostly anime and manga, of course. And I would later go and play Kingdom Hearts 1 and enjoy it almost as much. Kingdom Hearts 2 is one of my favorite games of all time. And the Sony PlayStation 2 provided me with tons of amazing experiences. One of my first tastes of games being art and not just boops and bops on a TV screen was Shadow of the Colossus, which is this beautiful, artsy, fun, giant world that still to this day, I can't believe they were able to fit on a PlayStation 2 disc. It is such an experience, and most of the times when you ask people what game really proves to you that games can be just as impactful as books, as movies, it's Shadow of the Colossus. This truly is a work of art, and the same can be said for Team Ico's earlier game, my personal favorite out of their trilogy, Ico. An amazing, intriguing game about a young boy who saves a young girl out of this mysterious castle in the mist. And this came out very early in the PlayStation lifespan. I believe this came out in 2001, so the PlayStation was only a year old at the time. It also gave me my first real taste of role-playing and my first experience with one of my favorite video game franchises of all time, with Dragon Quest VIII. I absolutely love this cover, that beautiful Akira Toriyama artwork, RIP of course. Dragon Quest VIII is arguably my favorite in the series. It goes back and forth between 8 and 5, but rest assured, this game is absolutely amazing. Once again, I just can't believe they were able to fit this world with this much content on the PlayStation 2. And that's not it for role-playing games, because even many years after the PlayStation 2 lifespan ended, I would still go back and bust out my PlayStation 2 and find new games that I've never played before, like Persona 4, which is my favorite Persona game. This takes you to a small town. You are solving a murder mystery. It is very much inspired by JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 4. The music is stunning, and it just provides you with one of your favorite casts in any video game ever. This is a behemoth, again, a 70 to 80 hour JRPG filled with amazing characters and stories. And speaking of stories, the PlayStation 2 provided us with what I think is the greatest story in video game history, Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. The writing that is displayed in this game, it just goes beyond the entire medium. This is some of the finest writing that I've ever experienced in fiction. It basically predicted where we are today in terms of fake news, manipulation of the news, manipulation of the media, manipulation of the masses. This is a very scary video game to play. It is a little clunky, of course, but if you can get through some clunky old gameplay, you'll find one of the best stories in media. And of course, I cannot go without mentioning this game. I would argue, once again, is probably a top 10 or a top 5 story in video game history, and that is Silent Hill 2, one of the scariest games out there. If you're a wiener like me, because I do get scared easily, and man, I don't know what it is, but those apartment buildings, they just scare me. Silent Hill 2 is such an experience. The same goes for 3. Unfortunately, it was rushed by Konami, and it didn't hit the same potential as 2, but it's still incredible. To round out what is a long intro, The PlayStation 2 provided me and so many players with experiences that we couldn't even imagine, couldn't even believe that we were having. And Sony had a genius idea. They didn't just make this a video game console. They put DVD player functionality in this. Not only that, but this console was cheaper than DVD players. So if you went to like a Best Buy and you saw a DVD player for $400 or $350 and you saw a PS2 for $250, it made no sense not to get the PS2. This was a time when Sony was cutting edge. This was a time where Sony was exactly what they needed to be. They weren't following trends. They weren't directly competing with anyone else in the industry. They were setting the trends. The other companies were trying to chase Sony because they were new when it came to the PlayStation 1, and they absolutely demolished somebody who had been in the industry for over 10 years at that time, Nintendo. And they would demolish Nintendo even worse with the PlayStation 2 compared to the GameCube, and they demolished the new competitor, Microsoft, with their Xbox. I'm saying all this because lately I've been thinking about where Sony has been for the past 5 years, ever since the PlayStation 5 came out. And it's honestly a tragedy. And we're going to get into that in 3 little chapters. The first chapter is going to be the rise of Sony, why they became this beloved player in the industry that people like me can't seem to let go of their glory days. The second chapter, we're going to be discussing the fall, where they are now. And then the third chapter is going to be a bit of a plot twist, but we'll get there.
Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Reyes, join me for a brief presentation. $299.
Before we get into the fall of Sony, I think it's important to recognize what made them so beloved in the first place. When the gaming industry crashed in the early 80s, one of the biggest factors was oversaturation of bad games. For example, the infamous E.T. game on Atari was made in approximately 36 days. Atari's port of Pac-Man had roughly 6 months, and it was still so bad that it's considered one of the worst video games of all time. Games were made so fast that stores didn't even have the shelf space to display them all. And we have to remember that video games cost even more back then than they do now. Adjusted for inflation, games cost around or sometimes over $100. And imagine buying E.T. for $100. Understandably so, consumers lost faith in the gaming industry and stopped buying as many games and hardware. And of course, 2 years later in America, Nintendo released their console, which had already been proven successful in Japan, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Basically, Nintendo had the philosophy of, hey, what if we made video games but made sure they were actually good and worth somebody's money? And with that philosophy and the Nintendo seal of quality, consumers could finally buy video games and feel slightly more confident in the fact that they'd be buying a decent game. And look, I'm not trying to over-romanticize the past. Of course, not every game back then was a banger, but the odds were slightly more in your favor. Nintendo was so strict about third-party companies making games for their systems that companies like Konami made fake companies to keep publishing games and get around some of these restrictions. I say all this because Nintendo was a trendsetter. They did things their way and it worked. It saved the gaming industry. And listen, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate for what I'm about to say, and I'm not trying to discredit them too much. I want to make it clear that I am no historian on this company. But I'm not fully convinced that Sega had enough of that same trend-setting attitude. Don't get me wrong, they broke a lot of ground and they did a lot of interesting things. They pushed gaming forward in a lot of cool ways. But they also made a ton of fatal mistakes in a short period of time. It's not just about setting the trend, it's also about instinctively knowing what trends to pursue and which not to. While not the first console to do so, Sony's prior experience in the music industry helped them pursue disc-based gaming, which is one of the many reasons why PS1 games were far more impressive than most of the N64 cartridge-based games. The PS1's ability to play music CDs showed consumers that Sony was focused on entertainment and not just games. This only continued with the DVD player in the PS2 and the Blu-ray player in the PS3, and of course the PSP had a lot of insane functionality beyond just gaming. This disc-based format allowed developers not only to fit more data on a single disc, but to produce games for way cheaper than a cartridge. This is why Sony benefited from so many games that were exclusive to their console. Games like the Crash trilogy, the Spyro trilogy, Silent Hill 1, Metal Gear Solid. Sony didn't own any of these, but their wise business choices led to those games being exclusive. Wow, it's almost like exclusive games helped PlayStation become the iconic brand it is today. You're not ready for that conversation though, clearly. Okay, but seriously, I think one thing I should have said in that video is I was mostly talking about first-party exclusives, because I do think it's important for a hardware manufacturer to have teams that know every nook and cranny of their hardware to make the best, most amazing games they possibly can. And obviously, for business reasons, those games would be exclusive. Or maybe not anymore, I really don't know. A lot of people think about Sony and they instantly think about their first-party lineup, but they weren't really known for that until the PlayStation 3. Sure, they had first-party games on the PS1 like Gran Turismo and my boy Parappa the Rapper, but it wasn't to the level we know today. It wasn't like Nintendo, where even back on the NES and the Super NES, people knew them for their iconic exclusive brands. I would honestly argue that it was in 2007 that Sony became focused on releasing first-party games. For the first time ever, Sony was getting overrun by its competition. It was the beginning of that generation, and the Xbox 360 just seemed to be more promising. And the casual, fascinating nature of the Wii and its motion controls led it to selling better than both the PS3 and the Xbox 360. Not only that, but the PS3 was built on the Cell processor, which infamously a lot of developers found challenging to work with. So a lot of third-party games ran worse on PS3 than on Xbox 360. So Sony rolled up their sleeves and began releasing banger exclusive first-party game after banger exclusive. The second half of the PlayStation 3 all the way through the PlayStation 4 lifespan is the golden age of Sony PlayStation first-party games. They had interesting and fun technology, they had extremely fun exclusive games, and they doubled down on some consumer-friendly tactics after Xbox tried to step away from them.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
PlayStation.
Of course, not every decision they made during this time was a smart one. They sabotaged and abandoned the Vita, and they still put out some clunky games like Knack. But I truly think Sony has always been at their strongest when they just did their own thing, when they let their developers stretch their legs and get creative. And whenever Sony did try to directly compete with another series, it almost never worked. Legend of Dragoon was supposed to be their Final Fantasy, and it's a good game, but it didn't really stick the landing. Killzone never became the Halo killer it was positioned to be, and people hardly ever talk about Mod Nation Racers or PlayStation All-Stars. Every time Sony tried to out Nintendo or out Xbox, it never worked. But when Sony was just Sony, it almost always had shining results. But unfortunately, we all know where this story goes. One of the most pleasurable experiences I had making a video for this channel was my video on The Last Guardian. Towards the end of that video, I started criticizing modern Sony for being so different than the company that allowed The Last Guardian to remain in development hell for so long. I give Sony a lot of credit for not canceling a game that probably started pre-production almost 10 years before it finally released. While the title of that video might be hyperbolic and outdated thanks to Astrobot, I think the general idea still stands. The Last Guardian is still unlike any other game I've ever played. The world is rich with gorgeous set pieces and memorable plot beats. It has its problems, of course, but if I was making a list of like the top 100 special video games everybody should play, it would be on it. Sony cared about giving fans something special. I think a lot of people have a sort of entitlement when it comes to games. Your favorite childhood games weren't made because Sony or Nintendo wanted to make child you happy. They were made to make a profit, just like video games today are. But there definitely seems to have been a shift in attitude over the past decade on how much is enough. The sad truth is, Sony is no longer a trendsetter. They are a trend follower. For the last 5 years, they've been following the biggest trend in AAA games, the live service trend. And what sucks is, unlike The Last Guardian, Sony actually cancelled what was shaping up to be a very promising game. The Last of Us Online, also known as The Last of Us Factions. This was supposed to be a fully fleshed out sequel to the first game's multiplayer mode. It started pre-production while Part 2 was still being made, so we can assume that the game had roughly 5 years of development time. We don't know too much about this game, but there were some mumbles from test players that it was actually pretty good. But the disgusting dumpster fire known as Bungie looked at The Last of Us Online and said to Naughty Dog, hey, this is pretty cool, but you do know that if you want to support this game, it needs to be your only focus for years, right? And so apparently, Naughty Dog and Sony agreed to cancel the game so they could keep focusing on their single player games. This is at least the story that we've been told. It kind of seems dumb and oblivious that a team as storied and legendary as Naughty Dog just seemingly forgot that they needed to support a live service game. It's possible that maybe The Last of Us Online wasn't really a live service game, it was just supposed to be like a fun $60 multiplayer game that was going to be supported for a year or two, but then Sony tried to shoehorn it into the live service initiative. We'll never really know. But this is what's so frustrating about Sony chasing the live service push. They don't really have any teams that were equipped for such a task. Most of their games are amazing AAA single player games, and it just makes no sense to ask those teams to make a live service game. And this led to some really awkward assignments. Like, they gave Bluepoint, the greatest remake studio in the industry, a God of War live service game. And even when they did try to acquire multiplayer based studios like Bungie, well, we saw what happened there. And then they tried to acquire Firewalk, and oh my god, it's so funny how they act like this never happened. This is honestly like maybe top 5 biggest L's in gaming history. Honestly, probably top 3. And look, you could blame it on Jim Ryan, you could blame it on Herman Holst, you can blame it on the shareholders, whatever. But the biggest shame is the loss of time. 10 years ago, if you said your game was in development for 1 year, that was actually kind of promising. But now, a year is like a fart in the wind. A year means almost nothing. Unless Bluepoint was somehow working on another game in the background, the sad reality is we're not going to see a Bluepoint game until we're probably in the 2030s, which is just sad and painful to think about. You can tell that something behind the scenes has changed at Sony because Shuhei Yoshida, the ex-president of PlayStation, who was mysteriously demoted to like the head of their indie game initiative, he's been doing a whole bunch of interviews in the past couple of months, and he outright said that if he was still in that position of president, he would not have gone so hard on the live service initiative. Picture this. You're on TikTok or Instagram and you see a story from an old friend that you used to be close with many years ago. You randomly decide to DM this old friend and you strike up a chat. You and them decide to meet up for lunch and hang out, just like the old days. But when you do meet up, your conversations are all about the old days. You're constantly saying, hey, remember this? Or, hey, remember when we... And that's when it hits you. You and this person are not really friends anymore. You're just bound together by the past. And when you look at this friend, you don't really get excited for the future. You just get excited about the past that you had with this friend. That's honestly how I feel about PlayStation. I mean, for God's sake, look how dusty my PlayStation 5 is. I was so excited when I bought this thing. Dude, I called all my friends. I called my dad. I was like, I finally got a PlayStation 5. Because it had been like 2 years since the thing came out and I didn't get one yet. And yeah, I've had a couple of great third-party experiences, but man, I can't believe it's almost over. We're looking at the PlayStation 6 probably in 2027, and it just feels like we barely got started. The PlayStation 5 is the icon, the emblem of the fall of Sony. Just kidding. I think it's important to accept the harsh reality that Sony is actually doing better than they ever have. They're making billions and billions of dollars and they're selling tons of consoles. They have already made more than they did in the entire PS1 and PS2 gen. Because most normal people who aren't as chronically online as me, and let's be honest, you, don't know what the hell a Concord is. They don't know who Bluepoint is. They buy a PS5 for Spider-Man and Madden and Fortnite, and that's it. So let me ask you a final question. If you were a higher up executive at Sony and your job was to make Sony money, and you look at your financial reports and you see that you're making more money than ever, would you stop going towards a live service game? And if you say anything other than no, you're lying. Honestly, over the past couple of years, I've felt my place in AAA gaming slowly fade away. Don't get me wrong, I still get excited about stuff, but like dude, last month I played Donkey Kong Bonanza and Pseudo Regalia, and to be honest, Pseudo Regalia kind of stuck with me way more. And I keep seeing these big companies making the dumbest freaking decisions I've ever seen. It's just sad, man. The PlayStation that I and so many people knew and loved is gone. Yeah, sure, they might throw us old heads a bone every now and then like Astrobot, but it's not the standard anymore. Their whole approach to this thing was just so wrong. They should have had like a Nick Fury type go around every team at Sony and be like, I'm building a team. And just find the top, I don't know, 20 people from each Sony studio who were really passionate about multiplayer games and assemble a brand new team that was meant to make a live service game. Instead, they've just wasted billions and billions on Concord, Firewalk, Bungie, this God of War live service game, and those billions of dollars could have gone to tons of great single player games. So I just want to say to all of you out there who are still watching, first of all, thank you. And second of all, if you want Sony to learn a lesson, if you want Sony to go back to the energy they had during the PS3 and the PS4 days, there's only one thing you can do. Stop giving them money. I know it's hard, right? Like, I know that if you only have one console, then yeah, every digital game you buy, 30% of that goes to Sony. But if you can, try and buy games on other platforms. The last thing I want to say is about a game like Fortnite or PUBG or Apex or Valorant, right? And that's, you just don't make one of those, right? You can't just create a success that easily, because every success has an element of luck to it. And I've always said this to my friends, I call it like the Drake or the Taylor Swift effect, right? Where if you look at the streaming numbers, Drake and Taylor Swift are the two biggest artists of all time. I'm pretty sure Drake has beaten like every record the Beatles ever had, which is freaking crazy. And here's the thing, you can't just make a Drake, you can't just make a Taylor Swift. Yeah, you can make music that sounds exactly like theirs, but you're not gonna get the numbers that they have, because there's only room for just a handful of those types of people. There's only room for a handful of these games. So no matter what Sony tries to do, they can't just make a Fortnite. They can't just make a GTA Online. I highly doubt when Rockstar made GTA 5 that they were determined to make what is essentially an MMO. And we know that because there's been rumors and reports that there were supposed to be single player expansions for GTA 5 and they were all canceled because of the unexpected success of GTA Online. Which should just tell you that you can't artificially create these things, they just happen. And I wish Sony knew that. Thank you so much for watching my video.